Welcome, everybody, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, May 20th, 2021. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,400 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented part 2, the Twin Towers explosive destruction. This is part 3, the Twin Towers in extreme heat, in which we'll be looking into the evidence of very high temperature incendiary chemical reactions involved in the destruction of these two skyscrapers. But first, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Mr. Andy Steele, and the host of 9/11 Freefall. Hey, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. I just want to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the webinar today. Best way to submit them is to go to ae911truth.org, select continuing education, and then select the live webinars. You'll see a box right there. I'll also be looking at our Facebook and YouTube broadcasts of today's webinar for any good comments or questions related to the material that Richard will be presenting. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort of what really happened at the Twin Towers and Building 7. I had similar responsibilities working on this $125 million mixed-use project, and this is near Las Vegas, with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So let's jump into it, because the scientific method is what we use in the West. We've had it 100 years or so. How we winnow error from truth, fact from fiction, reality from fantasy. We have a question. In this case, what brought the towers down? And we do some background research. How have other towers come down? We do make some observations, construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess as to how the towers came down. Maybe they came down by the planes that hit them, or the fires that ensued, or maybe the explosions after that. Our controlled demolition, which we've looked at a lot of evidence for so far in parts 1 and 2 of this series. And we'll be looking at even more today. We test these predictions with experiments that we make based on the hypotheses, which, by the way, we don't focus in on our own favorite hypotheses to the exclusions of others, based, for instance, on our affiliation with political or financial organizations that might sway our objective opinion in the matter. No, we have to be very, very objective in using the scientific method. And we'll find out how objective NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, was. They were tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. And we saw last week how they failed miserably, and we will see that again. We draw conclusions, and if the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. We don't hide them in a black box, saying that it might jeopardize public safety, for instance, if we were to release this to the architects and the engineers who are in fact tasked with ensuring the public safety in these buildings. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, as we will see NIST's and FEMA was not, we go back, we construct a new hypothesis, which is what we're about today, and construct a hypothesis that is corroborated by the evidence and so forth. So let's get into it. Let's look at some of the background research here. How have fires destroyed buildings? Well, not high rises, but say in a building that has a significant amount of fuel in it. Fire is an organic process. It moves through the building every 20 minutes or so in a given area, moving on then, looking for fresh new fuel sources. So if we have fires that bring, let's first acknowledge that what NIST admitted, that the fires don't persist in any one location in a modern skyscraper office building for more than about 20 or 30 minutes, because again, that's all the fuel there is in these buildings. So that's extremely important, because NIST shows these fires persisting in the area of the area of the jet plane impacts, even though the fuel was burned up. They suggest that those fires were too persistent. But let's say in wood frame buildings, not because we haven't lost a skyscraper before 9/11 or after due to fire. So this is a very unique case. It should have been extremely well studied. As you'll see, it was not. But say in wood frame buildings where the structure itself is the fuel, they can fall over to the path of least resistance. Following the laws of entropy, the building it increases in chaos. It's not going to fall straight down through, for instance, the path of thousands of tons of structure beneath the area of the fire, which is of course what all three skyscrapers did on 9/11, or is alleged to have done. But we have, fortunately, a test, the largest test of its kind, an 8-story building built just to be burned down with steel structure, and some of which was fireproofed and some of which was not. But a lot of fuel was put into this building to see what would happen. Well, let's find out.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently. Of course, he's referring here to 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse, allegedly due to fire. Well, what did the test find? It found that it's inherently stable, these structural steel buildings, due to the highly redundant nature of the form. So the connections do not fail. And this is the first thing that failed in the case of Building 7, which is alleged by NIST, which we looked at in part 1 of this series. If you missed that, you're going to want to look it up. Very important piece in this series, World Trade Center 7, the third tower that collapsed on 9/11. We will come back and do that webinar again in June, the first week of June. So we have buildings that have collapsed due to natural causes, in this case, earthquakes. The building falls to the path of least resistance. Again, the structure, columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. The building is recognizable as a building after the collapse. So keep in mind, this is what natural collapses might be expected to look like, as opposed to what we saw with regard to Building 7 and the Twin Towers in weeks 1 and 2 of this 3-part series. let's look at explosions. These buildings were blown up. They have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds that are expanding in cauliflower-shaped forms due to the rapidly expanding heat from the chemical ignition of the gases in the explosives. We have pulverized building materials suspended. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. Now that's important because explosions are not a part of this, the story of the collapse of these buildings, except for the explosion of the airplane and what they allege into the buildings and what they allege as explosions in the lobby due to jet fuel. So we have witnesses that see these things. So we're going to be looking for that. In fact, we did last week quite a bit. With controlled demolitions, we can take explosions and focus them very carefully with shaped cutter charges at key columns and beam locations throughout the building, severing those connections so that the building can fall straight down if that's what is desired. There's only a handful of companies that can accomplish this, of course, throughout the world. And then there's a set of features that we have looked at. Just to review, there's a sudden onset of destruction, usually near the base of the structure. A straight down symmetrical collapse is typically what ensues because the columns are removed in a patterned sequence. There's a free fall or near free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what should have been the greatest resistance, resulting also in the total dismemberment of the structural steel form. It's shattered. Feature number 6, limited damage to adjacent structures. That's certainly one of the goals of controlled demolition, at least traditional controlled demolition, which we saw applicable to the implosion of Building 7. We looked at something very different with regard to the Twin Towers explosive event. Feature 7, explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses, which is typical. The concrete floors are broken up. The explosive charges are visible at many of the charred floors. These are called squibs, which we looked at also last week. With chemical evidence of explosive devices left behind, we'll be focusing on that today. This is all direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. So with additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, well, let's stop and look at fires. Why haven't we, what is the history of high-rise fires? Let's take another look from this fine gentleman who did a review here.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. One firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, neither did this one. World Trade Center 5, which was mentioned, it is fully engulfed. If any of the World Trade Center buildings were to collapse, we'd expect it to be this one, right? Did it? No. High-rise, mid-rise, steel frame fireproofed skyscrapers do not collapse as a result of fire. And on 9/11, before 9/11, or after 9/11, these fully engulfed skyscrapers did not collapse either. And yet these skyscrapers collapsed by these fires, which are quite diminished at the time of the collapse, and cooler fires indicated by the thick black smoke. So why haven't we lost a skyscraper due to fires? Well, there's a few reasons. One, steel conducts the heat away from the source. So the steel rarely gets to its 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature, at which it can lose half of its strength. That's a critical temperature, which we never want to happen. So we put cementitious fireproofing on there. And in fact, we put enough fireproofing on there to keep that beam from reaching any significant temperatures for 2 or 3 hours. Now that's 4 to 6 times longer than the 20 minutes that fire can even burn in an area. So way conservative on the fireproofing. And we require the contractors to build out of non-combustible materials. We require the tenants not to bring in huge fuel loads, just desks and chairs, paper, which is highly regulated. We put fire sprinklers in to keep any of this from ever becoming a problem. So it's a highly redundant set of features, which is why we've never lost a steel frame fireproof skyscraper before. But with additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, like government documentation, you can't just bring down a skyscraper in the middle of Manhattan or anywhere without government approval. So people know about it in advance. They will be talking about it in advance. We saw evidence of that with regard to World Trade Center 7. With experts agreeing, yeah, that's a controlled demolition. At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether a building is collapsed due to controlled demolition, for instance. Video documentation also can be proof of controlled demolition, all of which we'll be looking at today, and we looked at last week in part 2 of this series. If you missed it, it's free on YouTube. Just search 9/11 An Architect's Guide. But let's get into then the Twin Towers, because we saw last week that a sudden onset of destruction, the patterned explosions and flashes of light, the straight down symmetrical progression, the ejections of building materials at various floors, the near free fall acceleration clocked by physicists, the total shattering of the steel frame all the way down to the core, the lateral ejection of structural steel sections weighing 4 to 8 tons laterally at 80 miles an hour, landing 600 feet in every direction. The pulverized concrete, which wasn't available then to crush the building, nor was the steel because it was distributed outside the footprint. So that's 2/3 the weight of the building we found was not even available to crush the building. That's extremely important. This is all direct evidence of destruction with explosives, not destruction by fire. Fire doesn't have those capabilities to do to any of those, let alone all of them. So we're going to be focusing today on some additional evidence, like pyroclastic-like clouds of superheated smoke, because the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 says look for thermal effects. And indeed, hang on one second. We're going to add one more slide here. which is always important to continuously improve. Thermal effects, what do you mean? Well, look for the large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. This is the guide that NIST should have been using. In fact, they were hired to help create it in the first place, but they didn't use it, obviously, as you will see, because they did not look for or identify these cauliflower-shaped, very hot ejections from the World Trade Center. In all the photographs and all the videos, these plumes of cauliflower-shaped expanding pyroclastic-like clouds, more evocative of volcanic than anything that could be produced by the heat from these fires. In fact, these fires were surely put out by the action of the collapsing building itself. So what's creating all the heat in those expanding plumes? We're looking for something on the order of this, and we find it. Let's go to Massimo Mazzucco's 9/11 New Pearl Harbor.
Possibly the most important unexplained phenomenon at Ground Zero are the extremely high temperatures registered under the rubble for many weeks after the collapses. On September 16, NASA shot these thermographic images of Ground Zero, indicating unusually high temperatures at the base of the 3 collapsed buildings. Despite the heavy rains of September 14th, the hotspots registered peak temperatures of more than 1,300 degrees under the rubble. 10 days later, the fires kept burning.
What's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out?
There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and then the tower goes down 5-6 stories underground.
But we had ABC crews come back just in the last few minutes and telling us there are still flames coming out of the base of the trade towers.
For the rescue workers, this became an additional burden on their already gruesome task.
Out still on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
On October 8th, the hotspots under the 3 collapsed buildings remained clearly visible. 6 weeks later, as the excavations progressed, the situation seemed only to get worse.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was the core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. And it's just a bright reddish orange color.
The consequences of such extreme temperatures were quite visible on the steel that was being extracted from the rubble.
Where the grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames, which was pretty spooky to see.
You would create an air pocket by moving steel, fueling the fires underground. But, you know, these underground fires were just like the fires of hell.
If you could make a video of what you perceive hell to look like, from fire shooting up at times, that's what would happen. You would be in the middle of what would look like steel, and then fire just would pop up. Firemen were coming out with, and ironworkers with their boots literally melted, and then the hose would come over and they would try to put that part out.
I got there.
Charlie Vichers was a supervisor of removal operations at Ground Zero. From PBS's America Rebuilds page, we read, Vichers' crew picked up 40 to 60-foot-long pieces of steel impaled in the pile, where the bottom 20 feet would be glowing red hot. Vichers said, trucks loaded with steel would pass by, and you could feel the back of your neck burning standing 20 feet away. In an article called A Dangerous Work Site, the U.S. Department of Labor wrote, underground fires burned at temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was confirmed by Mayor Giuliani.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
The Journal of the American Society of Safety Engineers wrote, thermal measurements taken by helicopter each day showed underground temperatures ranging from 400 to more than 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 weeks later, and the fires still had not subsided.
You see how this debris is still smoking? That's from the fires that are still burning. 8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. So, I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
11 weeks later, and the fires kept burning.
As recently as the end of November, it was still 1,100 degrees down underneath the rubble.
As November turned into December, ice was noticed in the mornings above the ground, but the debris underneath was still smoldering.
The weird thing was it was very cold when we were up there. I believe it was in the middle of the winter, but the ground wasn't frozen. The ground kind of like bubbled underneath your feet, which was kind of strange to me.
It took until December 19, more than 3 months after the collapses, for the last underground fire to be extinguished.
This is extraordinary because this doesn't happen in normal office fires. Listen to David Scott, structural engineer from Arup Associates. Red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile. It was dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter. Saw pools of literally molten steel at the World Trade Center, says the president of the cleanup company. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red-hot metal beams, ranging from molten metal, which was still red-hot weeks after the events. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains. Streams of molten metal that leaked from the hot cores and flowed down. Metal dripping from a beam, says this firefighter. Molten steel beams. The end of the beam would be dripping with molten steel. Mark Loiseau, president of Controlled Demolition, Inc., who had a contract for the cleanup company. Molten steel was encountered primarily during excavation of debris. There are video and photos of the molten steel being dipped out by the buckets of the excavators. They're just freaked out by all of this because this doesn't happen in office fires. Office fires can't melt steel, as you'll see. Was a little river of steel flowing. Who says this? The World Trade Center structural engineer himself, Leslie Robertson, and his associate, Richard Garlock. The debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running, like you see pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. NIST says in a frequently asked question, very frequently, years later, they publish that this must be molten aluminum from the airplane. But molten aluminum does not glow yellow and white hot in daylight conditions. So it must be something else. It's metal falling out of the material held in the crab claw excavator. In fact, concrete melts and flows around the handgun in this police museum. I didn't even know concrete could melt. And here it is, like lava around this handgun. This is in New York City today. You can go and see it. Evidence of 3,200 degree temperatures. The fires don't get half this hot typically. Office fires. Steel members in the debris pile appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures, says Jonathan Barnett, author of the FEMA report and fire protection engineer. But there's a problem here. It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. So where's that heat coming from? Here's a structural engineer who had access through a National Science Foundation grant. I saw the melting of girders at the World Trade Center. Abulhassan Astani Azal. If you remember the Salvador Dali paintings and with the clocks that are kind of melted, it can only happen if you get steel yellow hot or white hot around 2,000 degrees. But that's impossible with normal office fires. And that's impossible with jet fuel burning in open air, as you'll see. Let's go back to Massimo Mazzucco.
Another proof of extremely high temperatures reached during the collapse are the twisted and mangled steel beams found at ground zero.
Architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
You saw steel, some of the thickest steel I've ever seen, bent like a pretzel.
This 8-ton steel I-beam is 6 inches thick. It was selected to be preserved for future generations for the near-perfect horseshoe-like bend formed during the collapse.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
In fact, the temperature of 2800 degrees mentioned before is not casual at all, as that's exactly the temperature at which steel melts.
Well, maybe we're getting somewhere here, but how did these temperatures come about? Well, FEMA actually produced the Appendix C to the Building Performance Team Assessment Report in May of 2002. In it, they document some very interesting phenomena. A 1-inch column at the Twin Towers has been reduced to half-inch thickness, its edges curled like a paper scroll, thinned to almost razor sharpness. How does that happen? In the one piece of steel they managed to study in this study, they find rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting, liquid iron formed, sulfur forms during this hot sulfur corrosion attack on the steel. No clear explanation for the source of the sulfur has been identified, they say. Well, wait a minute. Well, where could it have come from? NIST produces, again, a very frequently asked question and an answer to it, or their answer. We'll come back to that. It's the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, says the New York Times, and yet it's completely ignored by NIST. This presence of sulfur. They suggest the sulfur is formed during, it's present in gypsum wallboard, which is in the interior partitions. Well, wait, no, it's not. Gypsum wallboard has inert calcium sulfate. It doesn't come out and attack the steel that for 100 years it's been designed to protect. This is just a pure fabrication on the part of NIST to try to answer these thousands of questions they were receiving years later on their website in the FAQ section. And besides, if sulfur is going to turn around and attack the steel, we would know by experiment, producing the hottest fires we can, putting broken up gypsum wallboard on it and see if it attacks the steel. Nope, it doesn't. NIST is lying. We've seen a lot of examples of that. The smell of sulfur permeated the World Trade Center. It burned, that smell of sulfur, says John Field, demolition worker. And yet, the co-project leader at NIST, John Gross, has this to say.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
But witnesses testify otherwise.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah.
Like lava.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And they pulled out a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
Well, here he is on the pile, finding the very piece of steel from World Trade Center 7 that was also analyzed in that metallurgical examination and put in Appendix C for the Building 7 section, which we looked at in part 1 of this series. They deny it, but their shadow is all over the evidence. So how do we get fires so hot? It's not from jet fuel. The manufacturer of the jet fuel says in open air it only burns 600 degrees. There's nothing magic or extraordinary about the heat producing capability of jet fuel in burning in open air. It's just a hydrocarbon, just like desks and chairs. They only burn 600 to 1400 degrees, typically. Sometimes. Yet steel had definitely melted during the event. You could see here by the color of the steel, melted steel or iron pouring out of the material held in the crab claw excavator. You can tell by its color what its temperature is. We're talking about 2,500 degree temperatures here due to the yellow and white hot material flowing out. How do they get that hot? These materials. And what caused it to melt? Well, NIST has an answer for this also in their very frequently asked questions. Any molten steel in the record was more likely due to the high temperature resulting from long exposure to combustion within the pile than to short exposure to fires or explosions while buildings were standing. What? There's a law of conservation of energy in a closed system, such as fires burning under water and under powdered concrete. The amount of energy is fixed. You can't create any more energy inside the system. The fire can't somehow get hotter than the capacity of the fuel that is burning. You can only convert it from one form to another. In this case, it dissipates. It doesn't get hotter. How about finding out what might be the source of this extreme heat? Could thermite have produced all that molten metal? Well, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermate were used, it would, one, explain the presence of this extreme heat. It produces 4,000 degrees of what? Molten iron. So we have a lot of evidence coming up about molten iron specifically, and no source for it in the official story. Would also explain the presence. It's not steel, it's molten iron. We haven't used iron in skyscrapers for 100 years or so. So this is not molten steel we'll be talking about. Would also explain the presence of sulfur. Sulfur being added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. Well, let's see if NFPA 921 was followed, because it says look for unusual residues that can arise from thermite or other pyrotechnic materials. This says we found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Later, they acknowledged in writing NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. What? You claim that there's no explosives used. No corroborating evidence. But you didn't even test for it. How can you make that claim in the first place? This is fraud upon fraud upon fraud. Others looked for it. It wasn't that hard to find. Stephen Jones, physicist formerly from Brigham Young University, a nuclear physicist, says, well, gosh, if thermite were used, it'd produce a characteristic burn pattern, a white, yellow, hot liquid metal, like we see pouring out of the South Tower, for instance, minutes prior to its collapse. He says it would also produce a whitish cloud of aluminum oxide ash, like we see rising from that pouring liquid metal 10 minutes before the South Tower collapses. And like we see trailing these individually freely flying structural steel sections weighing 4 to 8 tons. Why are they trailing thick white smoke clouds? All of them. Thousands of them. Steel is not flammable in office fire conditions. It is flammable when thermite has rendered the ends of it melted. And this collapse, well, what we're told was a collapse, looks more like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea, 2009. The collapses are identical also. These thick white smoke clouds are trailing thousands of these freely flying structural steel.
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames.
Steel is not flammable in office fire conditions. Stephen Jones says, well, the signature of thermite would leave behind a unique chemical evidence. Common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon, but more unusual elements such as fluorine and manganese also left behind. These elements in the periodic table of the elements. Well, he was sent a piece of this 40-pound chunk of meteorite, they called it, fused molten metal. They didn't know what else to call it because they'd never seen this in office fires before. So he works on this small chip and does electron microprobe data and finds that it's predominantly iron. It's not steel. It's not aluminum from the jet planes. It has abundant manganese. So you can again rule out structural steel as a major component. It has aluminum, sulfur, potassium. The molten metal is the residue of thermite. Clearly, this is a showstopper right here, but we're just getting warmed up because it has manganese and fluorine in abundance. What? What's that? Manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. Fluorine is used in very special thermite charges called sol gels, very advanced. So these are present in the residue and are a thermite fingerprint. But it gets even more interesting because sol gels would leave another residue, 1,3-diphenylpropane. The EPA analysis of the dust finds one molecule at present levels that dwarfed all others, 1,3-diphenylpropane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done. Another sculptor sent him a piece of slag from this sculpture, Stephen Jones. He does X-ray fluorescence analysis, finding iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese. In other words, again, the residue of ignited thermite. Now, you can make shaped cutter charges in your own backyard, as John Cole, civil engineer, did with thermite. And cutting right through steel. There you
That
go.
was reduced in thickness with gaping holes, thinned to almost razor sharpness, with a Swiss cheese appearance.
Where did we see that before? Oh, yeah, on the steel that was documented in the metallurgical examination in the Appendix C from the FEMA report in 2002. Well, there are much more sophisticated devices that are thermite based for cutting steel of much greater thicknesses than C4 and RDX, typical high energy explosives that are used in shaped cutter charges for controlled demolition. They project thermite on the order of hundreds of milliseconds, much more powerful. Why would they want to use a thermite-based apparatus instead of high-energy explosives? Well, those provide very loud bangs and very bright flashes, audio and visual signatures that would surely give away the hidden intention to bring these buildings down, because they would look just like the old hotels in Las Vegas. But thermite is a softer sound, a roar, which we heard plenty of witnesses of last week and the week before. And there are devices whose casings themselves are made out of consumable consolidated thermite. Nothing left behind but pools of molten iron, which we've already seen so many witnesses of. But what else was found in the fine powder from river to river, 3 square miles across lower Manhattan? The 2005 particle atlas by the U.S. Geological Survey finds billions of these previously molten iron microspheres, almost naked to the human eye. Some of them are about 1/16 of an inch large. They're in all the dust samples. They have no idea where they came from, but they document them very carefully. In fact, they comprise up to 6% of some of these dust samples, previously molten iron microspheres. By extrapolation, this is about 4 tons of molten iron throughout all the dust. It's 150 times more than common office dust, which can have particles of iron in it, but they're not spherical. They're not spherical like that are found in these. In fact, R.J. Lee Group, another environmental consulting engineering group, they said they're formed during the event, not before by the iron workers, the welders putting the building together, not afterward by those iron workers taking the building apart, but during the event, the melting of iron. Well, what does thermite do when you set it on fire? We'll come to that, but there's so many of these microspheres that they're used to distinguish the World Trade Center dust itself from common office building dust. They don't know what it is, but this is what makes World Trade Center dust. Well, here's a controlled demolition experiment that shows you what thermite does. A small amount of it, producing thousands of what look like sparks, but what turn out to be molten iron microspheres, which cool when they hit the pan. Could that be, why are they spherical? Aerosolized liquids form themselves into spherical droplets. That's just what the surface tension does to small particles of liquid like this. Could that be what's toasting the tops of these cars parked around the World Trade Center? What other rational explanation can there possibly be in this very obviously high heat event other than cooling, falling liquid molten iron droplets that the first responders were running from? Hold on 1 second. So we find that the dust contains something else of extremely important note. And it's collected, 7 samples from these different areas, independently collected, sent to this team with Stephen Jones and Niels Harrit and others. And they find that they have these curious red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other. They're attracted to a magnet. They're about 1/16 of an inch long, the largest of them. They thought they were paint chips, but they're attracted to a magnet, so they have a high iron content. They zoom in and do X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy on the red layer. They find that it's, they find aluminum and iron oxide, the ingredients of thermite. What is that doing in the paint chips and all the World Trade Center dust? That's the ingredients of thermite. They zoom in 50,000 times and find at the nanoscale, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair, these particles of iron oxide crystals, rhomboidal shaped, and aluminum platelets that are nano-engineered, set in a bed, a matrix of oxygen, silica, carbon, organic material, which is used in TNT to produce the concussive blast, the knockover effect. So this is earth-shattering in itself, but when they put it in a heater, a differential scanning calorimeter, they find that it produces a whole lot of energy at about 758 degrees Fahrenheit, and which is an exothermic reaction. So they've proven that these red-gray chips are thermitic. Paint doesn't do this. And what happens when they ignite? They create molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres found and documented in the dust. So you see, we know where these molten iron microspheres came from. They came from these chips, as if we didn't know, because they're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. So you see, this is an internally consistent set of repeatable experimental data that could be used in a court of law to bring the real perpetrators of 9/11 to justice. If we have the groundswell of public outcry for justice here, because we've got people in high places, engineers, who have nano-engineered thermite by making the surface, the size of these particles so small, the surface area becomes exponentially larger. The chemical reaction virtually instantaneous. They've engineered an incendiary to become explosive. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It's made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So we know where to go if there's the will to go there. This 25-page peer-reviewed paper is documented in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal in 2009. It's been out there for a long time, remains uncontested. The way to contest somebody's conspiracy theory is to produce a paper of your own disproving their results. This has not been done. A peer-reviewed paper. So today we've looked at features 8, 9, and 10, features that can only be explained as direct evidence of destruction with incendiaries, in this case, explosives in the case of last week. No evidence of destruction from fires. Fires don't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them, especially these fires, which, by the way, through thermal imaging video shows that they were not hot at all. 200, maybe 300, maybe 400 degrees, depending on the calibration. So the experts, what do they say? Well, we have 100 structural engineers among our 3,400 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation. Like Ronald Brookman, who says, doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why did the complete collapse of the Twin Towers become inevitable? Why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents to dust and twisted steel? Ed Muniak, fire protection engineer. The fires were very weak. NIST reports confirm that the steel temperatures were low. The World Trade Center collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire, because there hasn't been any collapses from fires. Well, surely the evidence must have been preserved in easily the most puzzling structural failures in history. Let's listen to the structural engineer who was trying to study it while it was being taken out from under him.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
Went to the melting pot, to China for recycling before forensic investigators could get their hands on it to do a proper, thorough forensic investigation. The mayor, Mike Bloomberg, who actually has an engineering degree, says just looking at a piece of metal generally doesn't tell you anything. In an effort to justify this destruction of evidence, it tells you everything. That's why they usually save all of the steel in a collapse. Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, therefore cries out crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. Easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history. We have 400 truckloads a day carting it to these barges sent to China. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. But it surely wasn't prosecuted. So through our use of the scientific method today, what have you been able to conclude? Did the jet planes bring the towers down? Did the ensuing fires, according to the official story? Or was it the explosions that we looked at last week, evidence of, or the incendiaries this week? Either way, amounting to controlled demolition. With these key features very uncharacteristic features, by the way, of controlled demolition we're looking at today. And last week, this is direct evidence of destruction. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony and evidence, we believe this is proof of controlled demolition, proof that has brought 3,400, almost 3,500 architects and engineers to the table, demanding a new investigation. So we want you to have an opportunity to ask your questions. And Andy, could you let us know how that might happen?
Sure, it definitely will happen if you submit them. So please submit any questions that you might have in the input form that we talked about earlier. That's at ae911truth.org. Just go to continuing education and select the live webinars. There's a box right there. And we will do our best to answer them. In the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed, you agree this evidence is compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Beautiful. While you're there, by the way, please subscribe to our email newsletter. Just go to ae911truth.org. You can get the latest evidence that we're putting together and that we're issuing to, as you'll see in a minute, all of these agencies for justice. The latest efforts we're making toward getting a real investigation. So do join us. You can get informed. We have an incredible evidence section on our website. And I encourage you to take a look at the videos and the papers there. And it's an inordinate amount of evidence, more than anybody needs to draw your own conclusions. And sign the petition along with the architects and engineers. Even if you're not one, we have 20,000 others supporting those architects and engineers. But especially if you are, add your name to the list there. Take a public stand for a real investigation and donate. If you have the opportunity to help us, we are a nonprofit organization. We do not get grants from large corporations or the government or anything like that. It's thousands of you that support the work that we're doing. A half a dozen of us need to keep working for you to get this information out there to the public, the media, the government agencies, etc. We never stop. And we're making films that are extraordinary. So become a member of AE911 Truth. Join the family of sustaining supporters. It's quite something to be a part of, isn't it, Andy? And how do they volunteer?
Absolutely. It's something amazing to be a part of all these years and to be at the ground level of seeing this movement go from where it was back in 2006 when I jumped on board to now. It's just it's a very humbling experience for everyone that's watched it grow. So you can be a part of that too. If you're got a few hours a week to donate and you got the time and energy and you're actually here to help, then please go to ae911truth.org, fill out the volunteer form. And there's a number of different things you can do depending on your skills, your time available, and how you want to help. Some people like being more out there in front. Some people like being in the back, but we can find things for you to do. But the first step, as I always say, is to decide that you're going to do something. So please consider going to that volunteer form and filling it out. I think Richard disappeared on me here. Where did he go? Oh, there he is. Oh, Richard, we can't hear you.
There we go. Have to replace the light battery once in a while. And so, yes, there's a whole section about volunteering with us. I encourage you to take a look at it, everybody. And if you like working on your own, you can do that too. Just get the information on our website and reach out to elected representatives, television, radio, newspaper. Send the ae911truth.org link to every architect and engineer that you can find, everybody else that you know. Screen the DVDs to people in your circle and outside your circle. Share them. There's a brochure that we have outlining all the evidence we've been looking at in this 3-part series. So you can get 100 of them for $10 on our website in this online store there. A lot of other great stuff there too. You can download the evaluation from Leroy Halsey, which is a finite element analysis of Building 7, which completely disproves the NIST project. He spent 3 years and 4 years on this project, $300,000 and lots and lots of data completely disproving the official story from NIST that fire didn't cause a collapse, and the building didn't experience a progressive collapse as is claimed by NIST. It was actually a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of all the columns in the building. What does that sound like to you? That's why we mailed 75,000 postcards to structural engineers all across the country. Created a film, which you can watch right now. Just go to ae911truth.org/7 and or WTC7, and you'll find it. You can watch it on Amazon Prime. It's a great film that's up there for watching. So encourage you to also support us in our effort to bring justice to the Campbell family. We're submitting this month the petition to the Attorney General there, and for a new inquest into Jeff's death. He was murdered in the 106th floor of the North Tower. So that's likely to bring in a lot of families to join that action. And wait a second. Okay. We have a whole slew of fire commissioners who have signed on to a resolution unanimously demanding a new investigation based on the evidence you've been looking at. We've also brought NIST to bear. We're in the process of bringing them to come clean with their fraudulent report on Building 7 through a request for correction, as we call it. We're also going to Congress with the results of all of these actions. Andy, what are we doing there?
Absolutely. We're always going to Congress, and that requires people out there to participate in the process, just like our government has always required you to participate just for any change to happen. So what we've been doing, especially since the whole COVID thing started, is requesting phone meetings with our representatives, not just our representatives, but also your representatives. And you can be a part of that. You can go to their website for your congressman, first learn who they are, and go to their contact us form. They usually have one, and select a meeting request. You can make a request for a meeting over the phone and include members of AE 911 Truth. It'll usually be Richard or Ted or both or myself. We will work it out, but we will get on the phone, and you don't even have to do most of the work. Unless you want to talk more, you can just introduce us and let us talk, but you can certainly participate as well. People have different comfort levels, but this is how we get change. This is how any changes happen in this world. And of course, what does it lead to is this right here, the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. This is draft legislation for a new investigation into the destruction of those 3 towers that fell in New York on September 11th. It's what we've been asking for years. One year we said, hey, why don't we just do most of the congressman's work for them? So we wrote the legislation. We just need a congressman to come forward and introduce it, and a whole lot of others to support it. So this is why your role in this is so important. And it's written in such a way that they can't just throw out a bunch of talking points from NIST and call it a day. They're going to have to actually address the information that Richard is bringing to all of you and to all of them constantly. So please get involved. And to learn more about that, you can go to ae911truth.org/justice.
Right on. And don't forget that we're still pending action with the grand jury project. We have submitted 60 exhibits now to the U.S. attorney in Manhattan, who's promised to follow the law, which requires him to give it to a special grand jury. We've sued them and requested proof that that's happening, and we're pending results there, as well as the FBI lawsuit, which we have sued the FBI for not giving to Congress our evidence when directed to do so in the 2015 9/11 Commission review. So that lawsuit is pending, also going back and forth. But I want to show you some more evidence, actually, just at least a minute of this documentary, which is our landmark work on this project, with 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out the evidence, which you've really only begun to see so far. Take a look at this.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We could speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dus dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nano-thermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-gray crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And yes, you can see that film free on YouTube, the 1-hour version, and the 90-minute version is even better, way better, and includes incredible slices of the psychology of 9/11 and why this is so difficult for people to get or to be willing to look at even, and how to talk to them about it. There's also additional excerpts from these experts on the bonus DVD there. So I encourage you to look at the Beyond Misinformation as well, the 50-page booklet on completely destroying the veneer of credibility that NIST is hiding under. And we have the classic version of this lecture, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, available too, free on YouTube. And as well, the 15-minute documentary on Building 7, narrated by actor Ed Asner. Very good. Encourage you to send that out to others. Hey, let's get to those questions, Andy.
Okay, we got 3 questions today. The first one asks, is it possible for the perpetrators to get access to the structural steel without being noticed?
I think we're referring to the steel in the core and the perimeter of the World Trade Center towers to plant shaped cutter charges, if that's what was done. And we know that in the World Trade Center towers, that tenants were moved around quite a bit in the months and years prior to 9/11. In fact, some researchers have cited that these towers were half empty, which would have made it a whole lot easier, of course. But if they had access to the core, the elevators, which is in the core, they in turn had access to all the core columns and beams in the core. And in fact, Ace Elevator had such a contract, modernizing the elevators in the World Trade Center in the 9 months prior to 9/11. This is a company that came out of nowhere compared to Otis Elevator, who had installed and had been maintaining these elevators for their whole life. So this outfit, Ace Elevator, had 85 employees in the buildings when the planes hit, and they fled. They didn't stick around to help the firefighters rescue the victims, and these are experts, of course, in the escape pods, the elevators. Quite suspect, a scandal documented in USA Today. So that's worthy of note. Also, so yeah, I think it's possible that they could have had the access and the time that they need due to all those reasons.
Okay, our next question is from YouTube. It says, okay, so we know we have a fingerprint related to the nano-thermite. Why can we not go backwards to the patent, to whoever owns it, and get into their records and see exactly who it was sold to at that time?
Well, we can't, because we don't have access to those records. We don't know. In fact, there is peer-reviewed literature, Los Alamos Lab and so forth, but these are not private companies. This is advanced defense contracting work. While there are some peer-reviewed papers that illuminate quite well the capability of super thermites, we don't have records who it was sold to. I mean, this is the kind of thing that you can do once you get a criminal case or a civil case into the judicial system, which we've been trying to do for 20 years now, all together in the 9/11 Truth Movement. And it's extremely difficult because they seem to have sewn up the judicial avenues toward justice in regards to 9/11. So it's extremely difficult to get the subpoena power you need to get the questions answered that's being asked here, although they're right on. Andy, do you have any other thoughts on those?
Well, I mean, if there's a journalist or somebody out there who wants to pursue that direction, they certainly should. I think it would be very difficult to do because, obviously, as Richard pointed out, it would be difficult to get our hands on those records. It's hard to get our hands on records that we should openly have. much less, very high-level Department of Defense records. And there's no guarantee that anything was even sold. I mean, if somebody had the components to be able to make this, they probably would have wanted to do this off the books. So, I mean, it's a worthy question of asking and pursuing. It just seems like it would be very difficult to get our hands on, but I encourage others to do that.
Yeah, once we get a real investigation and Congress is forced by you, our listeners, to act and get a real investigation, then they can exert their subpoena power and get some of these questions answered too.
Absolutely. And last question is from Facebook. It says, by admitting to not even testing for residue, aren't they admitting to a crime? Aren't they obliged to test for it? That's what the law states.
Now, I don't know what the law states that affects the criminals in the 9/11 events. This has been dubbed a terrorist attack, as opposed to an act of war, as opposed to a criminal act. So they dropped the requirements for preservation of evidence, and which would possibly include testing for residue. They didn't explain why they didn't test it. They admitted to that after claiming that there was no evidence of explosive residue. They admit that they never tested for it. So I don't know what the law requires in this case, but it's a larger body of justice that's going to be needed to force an official body into developing the kind of thorough investigation that's needed here. It's not something we can do. It's something that hundreds and thousands and millions of us can affect. But that's why we haven't given up, because we anticipate those days coming. Andy, what do you think?
The way I've understood it is that the NFPA guideline handbook was more of a recommendation and it's something that people typically follow. But the other side, I've heard defense saying, well, we don't have to do that. Well, okay, you don't have to do that, but you should be doing that in this case. So, I mean, they may have a legal foot to stand on, unfortunately. I'd have to look into that further, but I've heard that defense made is that, oh, that's just a mere recommendation that we do it, but we didn't have to do it. So they seem to hide behind that.
Yeah, they sure do. Okay. Is that all the questions?
That is it.
All right. So let's take a look what we've looked at today. The high-rise fires in some detail, the pyroclastic-like clouds, the molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite, nano-thermite. It's all evidence that needs to be brought into a court of law. And we've done our best to do that in several different occasions. And we hope we'll be successful still. That's really important work. Last week, we looked at the Twin Towers explosive destruction. Now, we started all over again in June, on the first Thursday in June at 1 p.m. Pacific, with a look at the third tower that collapsed on 9/11, World Trade Center Building 7, which looks just like the old hotels in Las Vegas. And we go through point by point, showing the evidence there. And again, pulling the rug out from underneath the NIST stack of fraud and lies that have been foisted upon the American people. So join us then. And until then, I'd like to thank Andy for helping me. And thanks everybody for joining us. And we'll see you in June.